Welcome back. This lesson will focus in what historians have labeled the immigrant generation. As you can see in the PowerPoint, it's between 1900 and 1930, give or take a few years. More than likely, I'll probably split up this lecture into a few different lessons. We're going to spend some time, more than in my Chicano Studies class, focusing on this generation and the Mexican American generation. And by the 1920s, we begin to see them overlap. So kind of want to take my time and address the politics of this generation. And I hope you notice that it reflects a lot of times the values of some of our parents who probably migrated to the United States. So even though it's a different time period, almost 100 years or over 100 years ago, the politics are still there. This notion of, they feel like Mexico is their home country. Whereas we, who reflect that Mexican American generation, feel like, no, the United States is our home country. They also see, they don't put too much stock in the United States because they don't see their time here as permanent. Maybe some of your parents felt this way too, where they wanted to come, make some money, and then go back to Mexico, right? Buy their land over there and basically live the rest of their life there. But things eventually change as they begin to have children and buy a home and things like that. But that was their ultimate goal. And that really reflects the politics of this particular generation. So here you see a picture of Mexican people migrating into the United States. This is probably around the 1930s, or I wouldn't say 1930s. You can see the straw hat right there, and that kind of gives it away. All right, but people migrating to the United States. All right, so like I said, I'm going to break up this lecture into a few different pieces. But we're going to address all these things. So it'll be one, I guess, I don't want to say one long lecture, but it's going to be a few different lectures addressing these kind of key points. So number one, we're going to identify what we mean by the immigrant generation. Number two, kind of address the politics of this generation, their goals, their aspirations. Now, this is not unique to the Mexican American experience to some extent, because we see a lot of people migrating to the US from Italy, from Germany, from Eastern Europe, from Russia at about the same time. And they kind of have the same mentality. Italian Americans, they went through some of the same experiences that some Mexican Americans went through. It's not completely the same, but there are some correlation there where we find about a third of them went back to Italy, in the 1920s and 30s. So again, there is, this is something that's happening throughout the United States. So it tells you a little bit about the politics, because a lot of them did not want to become American, right? That's one of the biggest myths that we have, is that immigrants come to the United States and they want to be American. It's actually quite the opposite. I think one statistic was about 3% of them wanted to be American. The rest of them wanted to maintain their identity. It's very common. I mean, just think of you moving to a different country. If you move to France, you're not going to become French right away, or you have some kind of French dream or anything like that. It takes maybe about a generation for that to take shape. So you'll still see yourself as American, and you'll have this kind of American exceptionalism type of mentality. But maybe if you start having little French kids, your kids will begin to have that kind of French mentality. But in saying so, we see a movement of people who see this as problematic. And they, in the 1900s, they developed a program to try to assimilate immigrants into the United States. And you read a chapter out of Vicky Luis's book that addresses this idea, right? And this is called progressivism, which is, the Americanization programs are part of a bigger program, bigger agenda called progressivism at the turn of the century. Now, they have good intentions, and Vicky Luis notes this, but it wasn't as successful as it's been perceived throughout history. And in doing so, we really kind of see how we challenge the concept of a melting pot, right? America, particularly at this time, is presented as a melting pot. And there might be an element of truth here and there, but for the most part, these immigrant groups decided not to assimilate. and even to some extent, not even acculturate. It's actually their children who begin to venture out of the barrios and venture out of Little Italy, right, out of their neighborhoods, and become a little bit more Americanized. Still maintaining some Mexican elements there, but becoming a little bit more Americanized. And this is what I mean that the Mexican American generation reflects maybe more you than some of your parents, particularly if they're immigrant parents. So let's begin by looking at this immigrant generation. So why did immigrants come to the United States? Well, there's two, to kind of put it simplistic, there's two forces at work here. Number one, you have what's called push factors. Right? If things were great in your home country, you would not leave. Right? Why would you want to leave, right? If things are perfect. It's like us today. Do you want to leave the United States? Well, some of us might at this particular moment for different reasons. But it takes a lot, right? It takes a lot for you to get up and leave. And that's what's happening in Mexico. You have what's called a dictator. They call it Porfiriato. And it's named after the president, Porfirio Diaz, where basically Porfirio Diaz runs the country as a dictator for about 30 years. Porfirio Diaz is famous because he participated in the Cinco de Mayo battle. He was one of the generals. A very kind of famous battle in Puebla. And he kind of gains in popularity, becomes president and a dictator. But in doing so, he really begins to change and transform Mexico, particularly in the 1890s, where he begins to invite foreign industries into Mexico. And it begins to impact the population in a very negative way. One of the industries that comes to Mexico is commercial agriculture. So when we think of farming, even in the United States, sometimes, I mean, we don't even think where our food comes from, right? We just see it at the grocery store. But understand that these tend to be kind of big industries, right? Big plots of land, some kind of faceless corporation called Green Giant or something like that. The same could be said what was happening back in this period where Mexico invites these giant corporations to come plant food, but the food wasn't meant for the local population. All right, and this is key as to what gives rise to these push factors that push people out of Mexico. So we find that people who once kind of grew their own food in Mexico, right, they kind of sustained themselves, are now being pushed off their land, and that land is being given to these commercial agricultural farms that plant food in Mexico, but is sent to other parts of the world, particularly Britain and the United States. They have an industrial economy, so they don't have a very rural economy, and they need to feed a population, right? So the food is coming from these what were once called third world countries, right, to feed a population across the ocean. And we still kind of see this today. I mean, if I'm not sure if you ever puzzled that you're eating a mango in the middle of winter, right? I was like, well, where did this come from? Well, it's probably coming from other parts of the world, such as Chile, right, or Peru, or somewhere south of the equator. And we don't put too much thought of it because we don't really care what happens to other people. As long as we have our food, we're happy, right? And this is exactly what's happening down in Mexico, is that people are being kicked off their land for the benefit of this new industrial economy. Now, a lot of kind of weird things happen where I think, people are just kind of kicked off their territory and being shipped to different parts of Mexico. So you grab these populations and just ship them around to places they never even been to or didn't want to go. And that's why I have here from beans to beets. So if you ever tasted a beet, it's not part of Mexican cuisine, right? We don't use it for our tacos or anything like that. Maybe today we might, as our food becomes a little bit more diverse. But the main staple was beans for many Mexicans, and they stopped producing that, and they moved to these products that Americans consume or British consume. And there's other problems. There's a lot of corruption in the Mexican government, and this kind of causes a revolution. It starts with the Magon brothers in the early 1900s, like 1905. You have these two brothers, along with other groups of people that begin to question Porfirio Diaz. They tend to be anarchists, and they kind of start this movement towards revolution. So the Mexican Revolution plays a very important role because once the revolution starts, it creates a lot of instability, right? Political instability, and most people don't want that. People want stability. So people begin to migrate out of the rural areas into the cities, and you have this upheaval, and then they begin to migrate to other parts of the country. And a lot of times these, Porfirio Diaz invites the train, the railroad companies, and they build railroads, and the Mexican people jump on these trains and they kind of use them to navigate through different parts of Mexico. And one way is moving to the border to El Paso, right? Or, at least by El Paso. And they cross right over. Because at this time, there's no border. It's just, there's nothing there, really. It's just open terrain. And that's a push factor, right? People are essentially feel like they're being pushed out of their home into different parts of Mexico, if not the United States. Now, there's also a pull factor. People are being pulled into the United States. So when we think about immigration, I don't want you to think of it as one-way street. It takes two to tango. So just as much as people are being pushed, people are being pulled to the U.S. And what happens at this time is that a lot of people come, because American companies are actually going to Mexico, to Europe, and asking for labor. They try to import cheap labor, basically, right? So they can lower the wages of workers. So many Mexicans at this time come because companies in the United States that are in commercial agriculture here, particularly in the West, are in need of cheap labor. So many of them come as what's called as solos, right? They come alone, which tends to be a very common migration pattern. And eventually they practice what's called chain migration because sometimes they're married and they migrate over here, but then they bring the wife, right? Or they bring other relatives, uncles, to join them over here. Once they're settled and on this side of the border. And slowly but surely more family might come, maybe the kids and so forth, right? And this is what we see taking place at the turn of the century. And as I mentioned a second ago, right, the reason why they're coming is because of jobs. American companies are going to different parts of the world, advertising jobs. These kind of, again, the myth of the American dream, streets are paved with gold, kind of nonsense. And obviously none of that's true, but they're doing it to convince people to leave their home to come to the United States so they can lower the wages of the American worker, right? Because you have these industrial booms happening here. So the railroads are, again, a very kind of key. Many Mexicans actually work in the railroads. And it's interesting because a lot of them migrate using the railroads, not only up to the border, but into the United States. So a lot of them actually work on the railroads. They're the ones who are kind of maintaining them and repairing them. And they end up in places like Chicago and Detroit and St. Paul, Minnesota. The last place you would think Mexicans will be during this time. Typically, we think of San Diego, Los Angeles, places in Texas, El Paso. But interesting enough, we see a lot of Mexicanos in places like St. Paul, Minnesota, right? Whoever knew Mexicans would be in St. Paul, Minnesota? I wouldn't want to be there. It's too cold. So once they're here, they begin to establish community, and they begin to the Mexican government actually creates what are called Mexican councils. I think in Spanish it's called consulado. My parents, I remember, used to go to them to get certain documentation that they needed when they were trying to get their citizenship. So they're still around, and these organizations are established in kind of high populated areas that have Mexican people, and they're there to support the population, but also they have their own political agenda there too, to obviously help them, but hoping that these people will one day return to Mexico and help Mexico develop into an industrial economy too. So they have what's called very kind of bourgeois ideology. They're not very radical, in other words. And they help the Mexican American community develop, these organizations called mutualistas, and in English they would be called mutual aid societies. And these are just kind of community organizations. You see them right here in these pictures that are established to help each other out. You might see things like this in Mexican communities because they don't. There's a little bit of distrust against American organizations. They don't quite trust them, as you saw with the reading with Americanization programs, right? A lot of Mexican families didn't want to go to them because they just don't know what they're about and what they want. So they develop their own organizations to help each other. But in doing so, they create not an American melting pot, but rather a Mexican melting pot. Because you have migrants from all over Mexico going to places like, say, Los Angeles, people from Mexico City, people from Guadalajara, Morelos, Puebla, Oaxaca. If you ever go to Mexico, there's friction between these people. Just the same way, like in Arizona, I see a lot of stickers that say "not Cal," so people hate people, Arizonians hate people from California for whatever reason. And right, but when you leave, let's say we were all to move to France, all of a sudden it's like, well, you tend to gravitate to people that are like you. It's like, well, I might hate Californians here in the United States, but now that I'm in France, I welcome another American, right? Regardless of where they're from. The same thing is happening here. These people that might not have gone along in Mexico, not that they hate each other or anything like that, but we make fun of each other in different cities, right? Chilangos and things like that. That's what they call people from Mexico City. And but when you're in the United States, at the very least, they speak Spanish. They share the same culture, the same food, the same values. So you create a Mexican melting pot in the United States rather than an American melting pot. And this is important because it challenges that perception of the American dream. And what are these organizations all about? Well, they're really about maintaining their Mexican identity. And you see it in the name of these organizations: Confederaciones de Sociedades Mexicanas, Hijos de México, right? So they have a connection not to the US, but rather to Mexico. And this is key because it develops their identity that is connected to the Madre Patria, Madre Patria, right? I believe that's what it said. And when they celebrate festivals, they celebrate not American festivals, not the 4th of July or Labor Day or whatever else we have, but they celebrate Mexican holidays. I mean, even today's Dia de las Madres, right? I think it's on Fridays in Mexico, whereas in the U.S. it's on Sundays. We still tend to celebrate the holidays from Mexico, so we have things like Cinco de Mayo, which isn't celebrated in Mexico. It's actually an American holiday that was celebrated by Mexicans. And they just try to find events that they can celebrate. So in Mexico, nobody really celebrated Cinco de Mayo besides Puebla, because that's where the battle took place. But on this side of the border, it creates a shared event where they can have a party, and it becomes much bigger over here. I mean, to the point that people assume Cinco de Mayo is associated with Independence Day, which obviously it's not, right? What else? Diciembre 12, right, which is the Virgen de Guadalupe. Dia de los Muertos, obviously Mexican independence, right? September 15th. So all these holidays that are celebrated in Mexico are brought over to the United States, and they're not really too consumed with American holidays, but more so with Mexican holidays. And the same thing is happening again with the Italians, with the Germans, so forth and so on. And they develop new family ties here, this concept called compadrazgo, right? They become compadres. And it's almost like a mini community in some of these barrios in Los Angeles. Why? Because they can only trust each other, right? They don't trust outsiders. And by outsiders, we mean Americanos. So they live in urban communities, sometimes by choice. I mean, you tend to gravitate to people that are like you, but also understand that Mexican Americans are segregated in barrios. So they live in different barrios. This is why East Los Angeles becomes the biggest barrio in California because they're not allowed to live in other particular areas, right? They do live actually downtown. If you know Placita Olvera, that tends to be a very kind of seedy area at this time. It's not a tourist spot like it is today. And they tend to live in these places. So sometimes by choice, but sometimes also by segregation, because they're not, even if you have money, you're not allowed to move into the better places. At this time, the better places would have been like Bunker Hill in Los Angeles, if you know LA. And during this period is the first time we actually see the word Chicano. In 1914 is the first time the word Chicano shows up on print. It's actually in a newspaper. And the word actually means pocho. So as these families begin to have kids, they begin to see their kids as almost kind of like fake Mexicans. And some of you have probably heard this from your parents. You might think you're all Mexicano and you're all badass and all that kind of good stuff, right? But your parents probably mock you, right? Because you speak Spanish funny, or you do things kind of weird. At least not the way Mexicans do it, right? The way maybe you cook your food. It's not real Mexican food. Your mom makes the real Mexican food, or your dad makes the real Mexican food. You Americanize it too much, right? You use corn or flour tortillas instead of corn tortillas, whatever it may be, right? So they see you as half a Mexican. So if you look at the word, if you put the M-E over here, it says Mexicano, and it says, and they kind of divide it up in half into Chicano because you're half a Mexican. So the word itself, where it derived from, there's a lot of debate, but again, 1914 is the first time we see it in print. And it's kind of natural for them to kind of think this way, not so much about just Chicanos, but this whole kind of ideology, because they're living in a time where every ethnic group sees their group as superior to any other. There's a Mexican writer, his name is Vasconcelos, and he writes this piece called La Raza Cósmica. And in this piece, he basically argues that Mexicans are the best because we have a little bit of everything, right? We're a little bit white, we're a little bit native, we're a little bit African, we're a little bit Asian. We have the best of everybody, and that's why we're superior, right? So even though we might be dirt poor, we know we're better, right? So it kind of follows this idea of that many other groups had at the same time of being superior to other ethnic groups. Now, in the context of this study focuses in Los Angeles because again, LA tends to be the biggest barrio in Southwest. The Mexican Council actually creates sub-organizations again to deal with some of the racism that some of these families are facing. For the most part, many of these families are saying like, I'm not going to be here long enough. I'm just here temporary. I'm just here to make money. Eventually, I'm going to go back to Mexico. However, some did stay for long periods of time. So the organizations were established to help the people that are here during this period of time. So they become the voice for the Mexican migrant during this period. And this organization fought really hard to support the Mexican people. And again, they had their political agenda too, because they wanted to make sure that these poor Mexicans maintain their Mexican identity. They didn't want them to Americanize. So they did whatever they could to help them so they can keep that Mexican identity, because they hoped that that one day they would return. Again, maybe some of your parents had that dream too, of buying their piece of land and bringing their industrialist ideas that they learned here back to Mexico. So they developed this concept called Mexico de afuera, where their identity is still very Mexican, but they're just living outside of Mexico temporarily. All right, that's what Mexico de afuera means. So again, nobody had that American dream, right? They just didn't care for it at that time, right? So one historian, actually one of my mentors, Mario Garcia, came up with this term called the Mexican dream. Many of them did not have the American dream, they had the Mexican dream. And the Mexican dream is associated with the idea of making money and going back to Mexico. That was always the hope for many of them. And here you see, these are some great pictures. I'm going to show you some pictures in this particular lecture. Here you see them celebrating Cinco de Mayo. Again, reverting back to holidays that they know, right, of who they are. Unfortunately, today it's become an American holiday, right? Every gringo becomes Mexican on Cinco de Mayo. The same way like every Mexican becomes Irish on St. Patrick's Day, right? And they even established their own schools. So you have the public school system, but some Mexicans who can afford to develop their own schools to teach their kids not, American history or not, things that relate to this country, but rather things that relate to Mexico. So all the curriculum was associated with the mother country. Lenu, stop it. And they, there were people who kind of, again, addressed the needs of Mexican Americans, such as Serafino Ramirez, who helped address some of the things that Mexicans were going through in East Los Angeles. At this time, East LA is unincorporated, which means they're not getting funds to put in, sewer lines, or some of the trash is not being picked up. So you have this kind of political activism happening at this time to address those needs. And like I said in one of the previous lectures, all we know is Cesar Chavez is the only activist in the Mexican American community. Here we see people much earlier than Chavez. So the Mexican Council organizes, kind of has Serafino help them organize Mexican Americans who are trying to push Mexican people out of East Los Angeles, because a lot of times Anglo-Americans are trying to buy the land so they can build it up and sell it for a higher profit. We'll see this happening in Chavez Ravine a little bit later in the 1950s, where they get pushed out of this old Chicano barrio where LA Stadium is at today. Here's another picture. These are kind of just cool pictures, right? Celebrate Cinco de Mayo, partying, and then you have them. Lenu, stop it. Sorry about that. And then you have Mexicans owning stores, and this becomes very important because once they start doing things like this, it means that you're kind of settling in the United States. All right, I'm going to stop it there, and we're going to come back and look at the progressives, which relates to the article that you had to read for this week.